won a battle against the Confederates at a place called Glorieta Pass in New Mexico, and named John Shivington. And the governor of Colorado enlists John Shivington to raise a force of Colorado militia. They're called the Colorado Volunteers. And their job is to basically patrol Colorado and find Native Americans, violating their treaties in any way that they can find, okay? Allowing people onto the reservation who they're not supposed to, going off the reservation for whatever reason, and use that as an opportunity to harass them. And so when Colonel Shivington finds out that the many Cheyenne have left the reservation, he and the Colorado Volunteers decide to chase them. In the meantime, when the Cheyenne under Black Kettle figure out that they're sort of being pursued by the Colorado Volunteers, they actually stop their trek trying to find the buffalo, and they go to the nearest U.S. Army base, and they turn themselves in to the commander of the Army base. This is in 1864. And the thing is, almost all of the U.S. Army commanders who really know what they're doing and who are experienced are in the East fighting the Civil War. So the U.S. Army officers you have out in the West sometimes are either officers who were really terrible, or they're officers who are extremely inexperienced. In this case, it was somebody who was extremely inexperienced. And he doesn't know what to do with all of these Cheyenne who've just shown up at this fort and turned themselves into him for leaving the reservation, and asked him to protect them. And so he tells them that he's going to send a telegraph to Washington, to his superiors, to find out what he's supposed to do with these people. In the meantime, he tells them to go to a place near there called Sand Creek, set up a camp so they can settle down and get some food and that go hunting and that sort of stuff and settle down there and await his word. He'll come to them and tell them what the federal government has told him he needs to do with them. Okay, so in the meantime, while he's off, wiring his superiors for directions and everything, Colonel Shivington finds out, and the Colorado Volunteers find out, that Black Kettle and the Cheyenne are camped at Sand Creek. And Shivington and his men ride all night to get there. Most of them, the entire way, they're also drinking extremely heavily. So that by the time they arrive at Sand Creek, many of them are extremely drunk. And when they begin to ride into the camp, Black Kettle, now most of the young men are off hunting to find something to eat. So basically what's left in the camp are the old people and the women and children. And when the Colorado Volunteers ride into the camp, Black Kettle thinks that they are the U.S. Army, come to deliver whatever news they have of what they're supposed to do with these Cheyenne who turn themselves over to them. Now, Black Kettle himself had been a scout for the U.S. Army for several years. He'd helped the U.S. Army in wars against other Native people. And he actually had a U.S. flag that had been given to him by the U.S. Army, and he had his discharge papers from the U.S. Army. He was enlisted in the U.S. Army as a scout. The U.S. Army tended to use Indian scouts a lot in wars with other Native people during this period. And his people had never really fought the U.S. Army. They had always sort of been friendly with the United States government. And so when Black Kettle sees this armed force ride into the camp, he assumes it's this U.S. Army commander come to deliver the news, and so he walks outside of his lodge with this U.S. flag and his discharge papers in one hand and the flag in the other. And Shivington and his men proceed to ride into the camp and kill everything that moves. He and his men, and then for hours afterwards, they sort of encircle the camp, and any movement they see, they fire into it. Then after that's done, they then descend into the camp and begin to mutilate the bodies of the people that they've killed. And again, most of the young men are gone because they're off hunting, but most of the old people and the women and children are massacred in an event that's become known as the Sand Creek Massacre. And in fact, Shivington and his men, when they return to Denver the next week, they're given a hero's parade. While most of them are riding in the parade with the body parts of these Native Americans that they've mutilated. In some cases, their genitalia, heads, ears, whatever, hanging off of their saddles. And the people in Denver give them a huge welcome, hero's welcome sort of parade. And the results of the Sand Creek Massacre are sort of two things. One is Shivington is arrested by the U.S. Army and put on trial, but it turns out the U.S. Army has no jurisdiction because he had left the U.S. Army. He was just this commander of Colorado Volunteers, and so the U.S. Army, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, has no jurisdiction over John Chivington, and so his case is tossed out of court. Of course, the people who do have jurisdiction are the territory of Colorado, but since he was acting on the orders of the governor of Colorado, who wants to rid Colorado of native people, they're not about to charge him with murder, and so Chivington actually is never charged for the Sand Creek Massacre. The other thing, though, that it does is that for other native people like the Sioux and the Arapaho and the rest of the Cheyenne and the Comanches and others, they see this. They see the fact that these people had turned themselves in to the U.S. government and had asked for protection from the U.S. government, and the U.S. government was unable to protect them, unable to stop this from happening. And so many more militant warriors and spiritual leaders among the remaining native groups in the West begin to sort of win the day in their communities, and that they argue basically, look, see what happened. We trusted the U.S. government, and this is what happened. And the only way to stop these things from happening is to fight back, is to use violence, is to attack. And so after the Civil War, when more settlers begin to arrive in the West, and when the U.S. Army begins to return to the West in a much more larger presence than they'd been during the Civil War, they find many native communities already predisposed to fight them and to resist them because of the experience of what had happened at the Sand Creek Massacre. Okay, that's the end of the Westward Movement lecture, and we'll talk about the sectionalism crisis, or the sectional crisis, in the next lecture.